Every truth hides a darker secret.
In the heart of Italy, a land of beauty, faith, and art, someone hunted in the dark. For 17 years, couples vanished beneath the olive trees. Their lives ended by a hand no one ever saw. The weapon was real. The fear, endless. This is not a legend. This is the Monster of Florence. There are places in the world that seem too beautiful for horror. The hills of Tuscany are one of them. Olive trees shimmer under the moon, vineyards sleep under the weight of summer air, and cities like Florence look eternal, untouched by time. But sometimes, in the most perfect landscapes, something begins to rot underneath. A secret grows, slowly, patiently, like a seed planted in the dark. And by the time the world notices, it has already taken root. Between 1968 and 1985, Tuscany lived through something it still hasn't woken up from. 17 years, 7 couples murdered, always on the outskirts of Florence, always at night. The press called him Illinois Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. For decades, people would argue whether he ever existed as a single man, or whether the monster was something larger, a network, a cult, or simply the reflection of a society that could not understand itself anymore. This isn't just a story about killings. It's about obsession, fear, and the way a city can begin to feed on its own mystery. Because sometimes, the real horror isn't the crime itself. It's the way people start seeing because of it. It began quietly, on a warm night in August 1968, near a small village called Signa. A young woman, Barbara Locchi, and her lover Antonio Lo Bianco were parked on a rural road. In the back seat, Barbara's 6-year-old son was asleep. A gunman approached the car and fired through the window. Point blank, cold, efficient. By morning, the boy was found wandering along the roadside, crying. The local police, unfamiliar with such brutality, blamed Barbara's husband, Stefano Mele. Jealousy, they said. A simple domestic crime. Mele confessed, then withdrew his confession, then confessed again. He was convicted and sent to prison. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because when Mele was still behind bars, the killings began again. Same weapon. Same method. And this time, the violence was even worse. Tuscany is not a place of shadows. Its villages breathe history and art, the faces of angels carved in stone, the paintings of Botticelli and Michelangelo. But between the vineyards and cypress trees are hundreds of small dirt roads, hidden clearings, lovers' lanes that twist and disappear into the night. Perfect for secrecy. Perfect for someone who knows the land. The monster always struck in these places. Where couples came to be alone, where the dark seemed harmless. He killed with precision, a .22 caliber Beretta pistol, loaded with Winchester H ammunition. He always attacked when the victims were inside a car. He always used the same type of weapon. And in time, his crimes began to show a ritualistic signature, something almost symbolic, or obscene. By the mid-1970s, the police realized that the murders followed a pattern stretching across years. Each time the same kind of bullets, the same marks on the shells. And every time, it happened when the moon was high. Italy had seen its share of crime, but this was different. It wasn't mafia, it wasn't money, it wasn't revenge. It was a shadow without motive. Newspapers gave it a name. And once a monster has a name, it begins to live in people's minds. Soon, parents warned their children not to stay out late. Young lovers avoided the countryside. And every flicker of headlights on a rural road could make a heart stop. The years that followed would expose everything. Incompetence, hysteria, witch hunts, and a justice system collapsing under its own fear. Hundreds of suspects. Dozens of ruined lives. And behind it all, the same Beretta, the same invisible hand, still somewhere out there. When the killings finally stopped in 1985, the relief felt fake. No one had been caught, no motive proven, no weapon found. Just silence. And the weight of a myth too heavy to die. They say Florence is a city that understands beauty better than truth. Perhaps that's why it never solved its ugliest mystery. This is not just a murder story. It's an X-ray of obsession. How an entire country fell into a labyrinth of theories. And how the search for a monster turned everyone into a suspect. The years passed. The summer of 1974 came, warm and heavy. Tuscany looked the same, sunburnt hills, quiet vineyards, silver olive leaves trembling in the heat. But on the night of September 14, 1974, the silence broke again. A couple, Stefania Pettini, 18, and Pasquale Gentilcore, 19, parked near Borgo San Lorenzo, a quiet area outside Florence. They never returned home. Both were shot with the same type of weapon as in 1968. A .22 Beretta, the same Winchester Super X cartridges with the H stamp. At first, police refused to believe it could be the same killer. Too much time had passed. Too far apart. But when the forensic team compared the bullets, the pattern was undeniable. The weapon was identical. The monster had returned. Between 1974 and 1981, the killings followed the same rhythm. Always couples. Always cars. Always the countryside, the kind of place where moonlight feels too white. And the only witnesses are the fields themselves. Each time, the killer fired through the windows. Then opened the doors. Each time, he left behind the same evidence. Precision, calmness, control. And then, slowly, a ritual began to appear. The female victims showed post-mortem mutilations, deliberate, surgical, impossible to misunderstand. The violence wasn't random anymore. It was communicative. Someone wanted the police, and the city, to read the crime scene like a message. The investigators reopened the old senior case from 1968. They went back to Stefano Melle's file, the jealous husband convicted years earlier. If Melle was still in prison when these new murders happened, he couldn't be the monster. So who was? Rumors spread fast. Italians, raised in a culture of secrets and sins, started whispering about black magic, satanic cults, secret groups that hunted couples for rituals. The tabloids called him Illinois Maniaco del Copiette, the maniac of lovers. But the police, under pressure, had to face a simpler and colder truth. A single weapon had been used across all the murders. The same Beretta, the same bullets, the same invisible hand. Every time a new couple was found, the country seemed to hold its breath. Politicians promised quick justice. Priests warned that God was punishing the moral decay of modern youth. And Florence, the city of art, of light, became obsessed with its shadow. People began to change small habits. Couples stopped parking in the countryside. Teenagers lied to their parents about where they were going. And the sound of a branch snapping in the dark was enough to make people run. For investigators, it became an endless circle. Every theory contradicted the last. Some said there was one killer. Others believed it was a group. Some thought it was someone local. A hunter, a farmer, a mechanic. Someone who knew the terrain too well. But the most haunting idea was this. Maybe the killer was hiding in plain sight, among the very men searching for him. That thought would come back, years later, to destroy lives and reputations. But in 1974, the city didn't know that yet. It only knew one thing. The monster was back. And he wasn't finished. By the early 1980s, Florence was living in a nightmare that refused to end. Every summer, when the air turned heavy and warm, people whispered the same question. Will he strike again? And he always did. June 6, 1981. A quiet field near Scandicci. Two young lovers, Giovanni Foggi, 30, and Carmela Danuccio, 21. Shot inside their car with the same .22 Beretta. Then, as before, the killer opened the doors. He moved slowly, deliberately, leaving marks that could never be mistaken for rage. He took something from the scene, a piece of the girl's body. A year later, 1982, Vicchio, Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini. Again, the same signature. Again, the same ammunition. The man had turned repetition into ritual. The monster wasn't killing for need, he was performing. And every act of violence was part of his script. The newspapers exploded. Headlines screamed Illinois monstro strikes again. Theories multiplied faster than facts. Some journalists said he was a doctor. Others, a butcher, a police officer, even a priest. Psychologists debated his motives on television. Sexual frustration, hatred of women, ritual purification, black magic. Everyone had an opinion. And every opinion made the real investigation harder. The police, under pressure, began chasing ghosts. Every man who owned a .22 caliber pistol became a suspect. Every loner, every hunter, every mechanic in Tuscany felt eyes on him. Forensic teams compared thousands of bullets. While reporters followed detectives, and detectives followed rumors. It was no longer a manhunt, it was hysteria. 1983. Another couple. Wilhelm Friedrich Horst Meyer, a German tourist, and his girlfriend Jensu Rontini. They were killed near a woodland area. By now, people expected the news. The shock was gone, replaced by fatigue and quiet terror. The monster had become a seasonal phenomenon. Like heat waves or wildfires. He came with the summer. And he disappeared when the nights grew cold. But the summer of 1985 would change everything. September 1985. A campsite near San Casciano Val di Pesa. Two young lovers, Nadine Mauriat and Jean-Michel Crevachvili, French tourists. They set up their tent in a quiet olive grove. That night, they were shot through the canvas. The killer entered, performed the same terrible ritual. And left, unseen. Only one thing was different. This time, he may have been interrupted. Jean-Michel managed to crawl out of the tent before dying. His body was found a few meters away, one hand stretched toward the road. The monster was almost caught. But almost doesn't count. By 1985, the people of Florence no longer believed in the police. The killings had become a mirror for everything that was wrong with Italy. Political chaos, corruption, the church, and the press feeding on tragedy. The monster wasn't just one man now. He was a symptom. And then came the investigation that changed everything. An investigation so chaotic, so desperate, that it destroyed the very people trying to solve the case. The detectives turned their eyes to a man from the countryside. A farmer named Pietro Pacciani. He was violent, rough, known for fights and for mistreating his family. He had served time for assault years before. He lived close to several of the murder sites. Pacciani looked like the perfect villain. He fit the myth. And in a country starving for closure, a myth was enough. But soon the case around him would twist and collapse. And Florence would realize that chasing a monster can turn you into one. By the early 1990s, the monster had stopped killing. But Florence was still bleeding from the memory. People needed an answer. A face to blame. A man to point at and say, that's him. And so, in 1993, they found one. Pietro Pacciani. A farmer. Old, angry, crude, with rough hands and a stare that made journalists uncomfortable. He had a past, violent arguments, an assault conviction, rumors of incest. He lived near San Casciano, not far from the last crime scene. He was perfect for the role. Too perfect, the newspapers went mad. The monster has a face. The farmer of death. They called him the embodiment of evil. But beneath the noise, the evidence was thin. No fingerprints. No weapon. No eyewitness. Just circumstantial traces, and fear. One of the detectives famously said, "He fits the monster like a glove. Maybe not the glove we wanted, but the glove the country needs." Pacciani's life became a circus. Television trucks parked outside his home. Neighbors whispered prayers. Tourists came to take photos of the monster's house. And for the first time in history, the Italian justice system turned a murder case into a national theater. The trial began in 1994. The prosecutors described a brutal man, a peasant twisted by lust and hate, who hunted couples in the countryside for 17 years. They spoke of trophies, of rituals, of a man who couldn't stop himself. The defense spoke of fabricated evidence, of witnesses pressured to speak, of police desperation after decades of failure. And in the middle, an old man, trembling, half-deaf, staring at a courtroom full of cameras. When the verdict came, the room went silent. Pietro Pacciani, guilty. Life imprisonment. Florence celebrated, briefly. But then came the appeals. And with them, doubt. 2 years later, the conviction was overturned. The higher court said the evidence was inconsistent, the testimonies unreliable. A new trial was ordered. Before it could begin, Pacciani was found dead in his home. Natural causes, they said. But many didn't believe it. Some whispered suicide. Others, silence. The monster had taken another victim, this time, the man accused of being him, but the story didn't end there. Because if Pacciani wasn't alone, then who were the others? The police turned their gaze to his friends, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti, 2 elderly men from the same rural area. Poor, uneducated. They were called I Compagni di Merende, the picnic companions. According to the new theory, these men formed a small group, a rural cult of sorts, hunting couples for pleasure or for the orders of a secret elite. The newspapers loved it. They spoke of rituals, orgies, powerful people paying for trophies. It was madness dressed as justice. In 1998, the verdict came again. Vanni and Lotti, guilty. Life sentences. But the myth refused to settle. There was still no weapon. Still no proof that the murders stopped because these men were caught. Even today, criminologists argue. Did they really exist as a group? Or was this the final act of a system that needed a monster more than it needed the truth? Florence had its scapegoats. Italy had closure, or something that looked like it. But the files remained open. The same gun was never found. And the pattern of bullets, the only real evidence, never fully matched the men behind bars. The Monster of Florence was no longer just a killer. He was a national obsession. A mirror reflecting corruption, fear, and superstition. In trying to find him, Italy exposed itself. The new century arrived with the illusion of clarity. DNA, databases, computers, science promised to fix what intuition had broken. For Florence, it felt like a second chance. Detectives reopened the monster files. Old evidence was pulled from archives. Rusted shell casings, cigarette butts, strands of hair sealed in yellowed envelopes. Technicians wore white gloves and hope. They believed that in the age of genomes and algorithms, the monster would finally speak. But when they tried to extract DNA from the evidence, the results came back blurred, incomplete, contaminated. The samples were simply too old. Some had been handled by dozens of people over the decades. Police, judges, journalists, archivists. Each left their own invisible fingerprints. The computer could find a profile, yes, but never the profile. It was like listening to a choir of ghosts. Each voice half-audible, none entirely human. In 2018, Italy's Forensic Institute announced another attempt. New sequencing methods, new hope. The public waited for headlines. But again, nothing definitive. The only clear message: the weapon had never been found. The same Beretta .22, the one that tied all the crimes together, remained a phantom. Without it, the case was a body with no spine. Meanwhile, journalists and online sleuths turned the monster into data. They digitized every police file, every headline, every map. Algorithms compared bullet trajectories, timelines, witness statements. A pattern emerged, not of one man, but of many small coincidences woven together by human fear. Some criminologists began to whisper, Maybe the monster was never one person. Maybe it was a coincidence that became a myth. A statistical ghost born out of chaos. It was an idea both comforting and terrifying. Comforting, because it suggested no superhuman evil existed. Terrifying, because it meant anyone, anywhere, could become part of it. 2023. A private DNA lab in Rome announced new genetic material found on old evidence. Headlines shouted, breakthrough in the monster case. A week later, silence. The sample had turned out to be a lab worker's contamination. The countryside, not in disappointment, but in recognition. They had seen this story too many times. 55 years after the first shot on that quiet Tuscan road, the Monster of Florence is still officially unsolved. The files rest in climate-controlled archives, monitored by silent cameras. Students of criminology visit them like pilgrims. And every new detective who opens those boxes feels the same chill, the weight of too many questions. Who pulled the trigger? How many hands were there? And why does the darkness of one man still echo across decades? Maybe the answer is that the monster was never a person. He was a mirror. A reflection of what happens when fear meets imagination. When a society that worships beauty refuses to look at its own ugliness. Florence built cathedrals, painted heavens, carved angels. But it also built this, a myth of perfect evil. And myths, unlike men, never die. We end here, in the silence after the headlines. No final arrest, no closure, only memory. Because sometimes, solving the mystery means understanding that it was never meant to be solved. If you've listened this far, thank you. You've walked through 17 years of fear, 50 years of questions, and one truth that never fades. Evil doesn't vanish. It evolves. Like the hills of Tuscany. It waits for nightfall.